Boelter Jones, Pro Football Hall of Famer, top 100.
Tyler Lockett from the Seattle Seahawks.
Metcalf.
Hey, Olson. You're watching NorbCam.
NorbCam.
You're watching NorbCam.
What's up, everybody? This is NorbCam coming at you live today on this Thursday. And I'm pretty excited about this topic today because this is something I really don't know a whole heck of a lot about. For those of you who are into fantasy football, and I know there's a lot of you out there, many of you ask me, hey, Norb, you got any fantasy advice or do you want to join a fantasy league? And I'm always the first one to go, dude, I got 2 daughters. Big time into volleyball. I can barely keep up with the Seahawks and their stuff. I know that if I jumped in and started doing fantasy, I'd get addicted because I have an addictive personality, whether it's like games or TV shows. So I've always stayed away. But at the same time, I've never really had someone to turn to for good fantasy advice to kind of get me rolling. But it just so happens I ran into this gentleman who is one of the best, if not the best, in the fantasy football business. And I want to bring him today here to talk some fantasy football, talk a little Seahawks, and really just kind of give you guys a chance also in the chat to send any questions you might have regarding fantasy for 2020. I'd like to, at this point, introduce to you guys my special guest. This is Joseph, from the Fantasy Football Counselor. Joseph, welcome to the show.
How's it going, guys? Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
You bet, man. You bet. So, first of all, I appreciate you taking the time to be on here. And like I said in my intro, I don't know a lot about fantasy. I know there's all these different leagues and all these different things, but I'm going to take it from the standpoint if there's other people out there kind of like me. Obviously, this is a Seahawks channel. So my first interest is, well, how do the Seahawks sort of fare looking and going into 2020? I'd love to kind of get your take on it. But before you jump into it, first, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are, your show, and what you do?
Sure. Appreciate you having me on. I'm probably the craziest, most passionate fantasy football analyst out there. Started my brand 4 years ago. Since then, I'm very grateful to be number one on social media. You guys check me out on my verified Instagram page, number one on Instagram. I started out on Instagram, kind of cornered that market. First to brand on there, first vlogger really for fantasy football analysis on social. And, I have a YouTube channel as well. And again, my mission is that everybody wins. I'm obsessed with winning, and not only in business, but actually in fantasy football. So my mission is to give you advice that's away from the mainstream consensus. It's advice that's not cookie cutter. And I don't try to be different on purpose. I'm genuinely trying to give you guys advice to help you win. And in order to win, you got to think outside the box a little bit. You can't just take last year's top finishers and say, hey, these guys finished on top, I've got to draft them again. You got to look at all the variables, and that's basically my mission, is to help you guys win, not only in fantasy, but in reality football as well.
All right, so I see in the chat, I got Nick LeBeau, a regular viewer of the show. He says in the super chat, Joseph is my fantasy guy on Instagram. Thanks for all the advice. So, go Hawks. So you got a fan in the chat who's also a fan of mine connecting right here. So this is awesome. Thank you, Nick LeBeau. So how do we start on this? I guess if I'm a newbie, and let's say I came to you, Joseph, and I said, dude, I've been putting this off for years. I want this year to be the year. And this might be the year, given what's happening in this world today. This might be the year for me to jump into fantasy football. What would you start by telling me if I wanted to go in not knowing a thing about it? And I said, dude, I want to get into a league. I want to learn everything about fantasy football. How do I get started? What would you say to someone like me?
I hate to say it because it's my own product, but if you literally have done nothing, and I mean like literally nothing in regards to fantasy prior to getting into it, I created something called the 16-round draft solution. It's literally like a cheat sheet. I tell you all the optimal players to draft in each round. And by using this, it's literally a video training of me talking. And I think you've got a link below here.
I did. I put it it's in the description, so you guys can check it out.
Perfect. So if you're absolutely new to this, first of all, I say dive in because it really enhances that game watching experience. Now, mind you, if you are a Seahawks fan and you don't have a Seahawks player on your team, it's going to probably upset you a little bit. Playing against the Seahawks, you might end up rooting for your fantasy player who's, let's say, on the Colts or maybe even on the Rams if you have a Rams player. Hate to say that, right? I'm going to stir some emotions here. So I got to tell you, if you want to get into it, just dive right in. But the 16 rounds, you're going to blow away the competition because I'm literally in a video training telling you all the optimal players to draft. So your friends will be like, okay, this newbie is in here, but how does he know all the players? How is he beating me? That's why. But again, just dive right in. And it's not just drafting a team, but it's totally being on top of the waiver wire and all that stuff. And I also have a Fantasy Football 101 section on my website as well at thefantasyfootballcouncil.com. You can check out as well. But just dive in. You're going to enjoy it. Absolutely.
So if I'm a Seahawk, I know I haven't played it, so I'm not familiar with the actual, the drafting and the leagues and all that stuff. But I do know that just from what I talked about with other people. So I am a Seahawks fan, tried and true. And I know so many times you got people who are fans of teams, but then they have to create their teams. And obviously what they want to do in fantasy goes against rooting or picking guys who are on your team. When you approach it this way, do you kind of have to drop all of your allegiances to your team and just think strictly talent and it doesn't matter who you're rooting for? You have to kind of drop all that? Is that kind of how you have to approach it?
Yeah, you cannot be biased for a team. That will ruin you. That's one of the Achilles heels of fantasy football. Unless the player is significantly really good in fantasy, and then in that case, like Russell Wilson, like I consider drafting Russell Wilson 100%. The guy's been a consistent fantasy producer. His average draft position in fantasy league right now is in and around round 6 to 7. He may fall to the 8th, depending on how many people are in your league. So you got to draft a player that's significantly good in fantasy, that's been a consistent producer, but also don't overpay for them. Just because you love Russell Wilson doesn't mean you have to draft them in the first round, because you can get them in the 7th round. So don't overpay if you want that player on your team that you love. Don't overpay, and also make sure that they actually will produce from a fantasy perspective.
So when you say you don't draft Russell Wilson to the 6th or 7th round, does that mean, as in the real draft, but this is now fantasy, what you're saying is in your first or second round you would draft a higher level fantasy quarterback, and then you're going to get somebody, all these other positions, and by the time you get to Russell Wilson, he's 6th or 7th round because he's just not us. He doesn't belong on your team any earlier than that. I guess we just had a show yesterday talking about Russell Wilson being ranked 33rd on the Pro Football Focus's all-decade team at the number 33, and me and some of my guests were talking about how the heck did he get ranked so low? How does that correspond to your evaluation from a fantasy standpoint, putting Russell Wilson, drafting him at, say, the 6th or 7th round? How does that connect with the reality of his rankings in the NFL?
Good question. I mean, reality and fantasy, totally different things. I mean, Russell could go in and basically win the whole season. He wins every single game, but throws, let's say, 1 touchdown all season. Just hypothetically speaking. I know it's an extreme example. I get it. But if he's not producing actual fantasy points, meaning if he throws the ball in for a touchdown, it gets him 4 points, for example, and he rushes for 10 yards, which gets him another point. If he's not actually physically putting in fantasy points, he's ranked differently. So the mainstream kind of does this, and every website that allows you to basically do a fantasy draft kind of has like an average draft position based on pretty much last year's performances. So you can get Russell Wilson based on last year's performance, right? The way he's ranked this year on his ADP, you can get him in the 6th round. You don't want to overpay him. A guy like Lamar Jackson, for example, his average draft position is very early. I don't recommend you guys ever get a quarterback early. There's a ton of depth at that position. You always load up on running backs early. So like Lamar Jackson's coming off in the 2nd round because he had such an amazing fantasy year last year, right? So that's kind of the whole idea behind it. Does it kind of make more sense?
Well, Lamar Jackson was the league MVP last year, I guess. And if I didn't know anything, I don't know anything about this, I would think if I'm drafting, the first guy I would go after would be a Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes type. But is that misguided? You're saying you wouldn't even get him in the 1st round, you get him in the 2nd round? So who goes before somebody like an MVP Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes?
Well, from a fantasy perspective, Lamar was the top fantasy point getter last year. That's simple. So he's going to be pretty much the first quarterback to come off the board. Now, because he did so well and his fantasy points were so high, people are drafting him really early in the 2nd round. So there really is no one above Lamar. But again, if he did really well in regards to reality but didn't put up fantasy points, his average draft position would be lower, and you could probably get him as well in and around the 6th round. But he produced both in reality and, ironically, in fantasy as well last year.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Seahawks' other positions. So what's your take on... We talked on your show last time. I made an appearance on your show. We talked a little bit about DK Metcalf. So share with me, for those of us who are again, that were watching this are mostly Seahawks fans, who are some of the players that you are excited about? I guess who you would sort of have high on your list as guys that you're sort of got circled that you got your eye on. We already talked about Russell Wilson, but tell me maybe some of your 5 favorite guys who you definitely would want to try to draft early from a Seahawks roster.
To be honest with you, and you're going to hate me for me to say this, the only 2 people I would like from the Seahawks this year are Russell Wilson in and around 6, round 7 as my quarterback 1, and I may consider DK Metcalf depending on where I can get him. Now, I go something with a robust RB strategy, okay? Look that up. You can probably find it on Google. I've kind of really been pushing that for years. So the robust RB strategy means load up on running backs with minimal committees, okay? So guys like your Saquon early on, back them up with a Todd Gurley or, for example, a Josh Jacobs if you can get them. Go for those running backs early, okay? But when you look at DK Metcalf, he's coming off in and around rounds 4 to 5. Now, I trust him in regards to ceiling. I think he's going to get more work than last year, but I also want to make sure I get another wide receiver and another couple wide receivers as well after that. And you can get a ton of wide receivers after the 4th, 5th round, okay? But DK Metcalf, he has that ceiling, and then Russell Wilson. I'm having a hard time trusting Chris Carson this year. Well, every year, he hasn't finished a full season. And I got to be honest with you guys, I know I'm going to hurt a lot of feelings here for Seahawks fans. I love Chris Carson. I love the talent, love the upside. I love him as a person. But in regards to fantasy, he hasn't been able to stay completely healthy. And what's concerning me here as well is that you probably know this better than me, weren't they making an offer, or isn't there still offer out on the table for Devonta Freeman right now?
Yeah, they just announced yesterday that they're looking to other veteran running backs such as Freeman. I think because of the fact that it looks like Rashad Penny is going to start on the PUP list, so that's already one of the 2 workhorses not going to be available. So then that puts kind of the weight on Chris Carson, and I think obviously the durability issues come into play there. So we're already facing what plagued the Seahawks' problems last year at the end of the season with no running backs, no healthy running back stable. So there's been rumor talk about Marshawn Lynch, but I think that's more talk than actual weight. A lot of fantasy, not fantasy football, but fantasy for Seahawks fans to hope that Marshawn Lynch could actually come back in some sort of productive manner. But it is a little bit concerning, and of course Carson coming off of his own injury, we don't know how set he's going to be. So yeah, but we did pick up a running back in the draft late. But I think there's definitely some concerns that the fact that they got to keep looking under some rocks for some veterans out there is a little bit concerning, and I can see why Chris Carson would be a little bit might want to not jump in there. So I want to ask you, we didn't talk about this much from the wide receiver standpoint, but what about Tyler Lockett? Tyler Lockett has been arguably one of the best receivers on the Seahawks roster. How does he rank in terms of fantasy football productivity?
He's safe. He's one of those guys I like to call as a safe wide receiver 2 on your team. So he's not a guy that you want as your primary receiver ideally and typically. Now, he had a really good 2019 season, finishing actually 13th amongst wide receivers. It was a safe season, right? 110 targets, 82 receptions. He had 8 touchdowns. I think that's going to change. I see Metcalf being integrated a lot more this year. I think they might use their tight ends. They've kind of emerged a little bit. He's a safe guy. He's not a guy that's going to give me a high ceiling. I have this saying, I say, years to wow me, and I'm not wowed, okay? So I always view him as a guy that's kind of a complimentary receiver. I've always thought of him, I hate to say this, and you guys may get butthurt, but I'm here to hurt people's feelings because I speak the truth. I've always thought of him as kind of a backseat guy to Baldwin. I've always looked at him as a wide receiver too. I never see him as an elite talent guy, especially from a fan. I'm very biased to a fantasy perspective, okay? Years to wow me, Norb, and I'm not wowed. So I could care less, but I love the ceiling of Metcalf. That's the guy I'm targeting because I see more of a high ceiling with him.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we could argue that all day long, but fantasy football's like I said, a totally different thing, and I realize it's hard to separate the fan aspect of loving your team to who's really the best player out on the field. So again, I defer to you from the fantasy expertise side of things. So tell me a little bit then. I guess if you're drafting for 2020, then who are the top 5 players that you have to get then? Can you reveal that information? Like if I were just if you're to mock project, whatever you do, make sure if you're starting off, you've got to get this guy, if at all costs, you got to get this guy. What would be the 5 players that are must-haves at the top of your list if you're building your fantasy roster?
That's a good question. Now, see, this is kind of a tricky question, the way you kind of phrased it. So if you're drafting in the first round, there's a certain amount of players I have to have in the first round. Second round, a certain amount of players I have to get in the second round, right? But there's certain players that I absolutely must have, right, in general. So from a draft perspective, in the first round, I got to try to lock down and it depends on where you go in the draft. If you're drafting early, Saquon Barkley. I love him. I love Derrick Henry. A lot of people will say Christian McCaffrey had an amazing record, pretty much record fantasy year last year. 471 PPR fantasy points. For those who don't know what PPR is, point per reception. So the receiver or running back that catches the ball, whoever catches the ball, gets an additional point just for catching the ball. So it's 1 point per reception. And there's half point, and then there's standard leagues where you don't get the credit for the point. So obviously, those 3 guys. Now, if you're drafting at the mid-rounds, you could still probably look at maybe a Michael Thomas. I don't like to go wide receiver mid-round. Michael Thomas actually coming off pretty early. And then maybe even Josh Jacobs late first round. I love him. I definitely, in regards to value picks, must have on my team. This is a guy that I've been preaching for years. Had some bad luck lately is David Johnson. This guy's coming off in the 4th round. I got to get him for that ADP. And why? Because he's going to be a workhorse in Houston. He's going to get the volume. He's going to catch the ball out of the backfield. You're definitely going to want to target him. He's a definite must-have as well. So my goal in the first 4 or 5 rounds is to load up on those running backs. I think Gurley's actually in a good position to succeed, aside from the arthritis, to be that workhorse running back as well. Fournette, he has to get paid as well. So these are some names here that I absolutely love early on in the draft.
Interesting. So running back, it's really more positional. That a running back is just one of the most valuable positions, even more than a quarterback.
Yes, it's very scarce, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of these, and we just heard it right now, you may not be a fan of them, but the Rams are going running back by committee now. That's what McVay just said. This, to me, is a fantasy nightmare because it's a very scarce position because there's only a handful. Your Gurley, your Saquon, your Henry, your Zeke. Zeke's another guy I must have early. There's only.
So I'm curious, outside of fantasy, if you can actually separate yourself out of fantasy, I assume at some point, or maybe you still do, do you have a favorite team, an actual team that you love? And would you mind telling who that is? Who is that?
I really grew up watching Peyton Manning and the Colts, so I got it behind me here. I'd say the Colts. Right now, they're pissing me off because they're talking about Marlon Mack, ironically, and Jonathan Taylor being in a committee. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. Once you get into fantasy, you start hating your team because they make moves that could affect your fantasy team. So imagine you're playing this week and it's a fantasy lineup and you got Tyler Lockett in your lineup, okay? And Russell, the game's on the line and you don't care if DK Metcalf gets the touchdown and wins the game. And let's say he does, but you have Lockett started on your lineup and that ball didn't go to Tyler Lockett. You're going to hate your Seahawks because you're going to want Tyler Lockett to catch the ball, but it was Metcalf. So you're literally going to probably start hating DK Metcalf because he caught the ball and he wasn't on your team. And that's what I'm talking about, is you're going to have fantasy football biased.
Gotcha. Yes, and I'm familiar with that. Just that whole aspect that you hate somebody one week and the next week you love somebody else, or you're hating and loving the same 2 teams that you normally don't like or love, and then you hate them that week just because it's messing with your whole fantasy thing. So I guess being that you have to stay on top of these things from a fantasy standpoint, how does this translate to just in terms of watching the game of football in general. So I'm sure at this point you've got a pretty good idea of probably which teams you think are going to be successful this year. Obviously, you ask anybody and everyone's hopeful, thinking, "Oh, my team's got a chance for the Super Bowl this year. My team's going 12-4, 13-3." What's your take on the Seahawks? Now, pulling your fantasy hat off for a second now, and let's just talk regular football. What's your take on the Seahawks this year? Do you have any sense as to what you would say? How do you think the Seahawks will fare in the NFC West and in the NFL in general? Can you give us some hope as Seahawks fans? What do you think Seattle's going to do this year?
That's a good question. I think they've got a solid offense. I think Russell Wilson, I mean, as long as you have Russell Wilson and that experience on your team, they're gonna thrive. They're gonna do well every single year. My only concern again is the backfield. Is Carson gonna stay healthy? If Carson can stay healthy and they really let him pound the ball and he does it consistently, they're going to do amazing. I think Metcalf takes a step up this year. All around good. I mean, I'm surprised. I thought there'd be a little more focus on the O-line in the NFL draft. I mean, that would have been nice, just a little more protection there for Russell so he doesn't have to scramble as much, even though we know he can, and he's probably the most elusive running back in the game. You can make an argument now with Lamar Jackson and Kyler and a couple other guys, but ultra elusive. I love Russell Wilson. I mean, having him there, it's just the anchor to the team. I mean, they're going to go far, and they're going to continue to go far. Again, my concern right now is pretty much the O-line and the health of the backfield.
There's a question for the chat from Robin Roziers. Says, which defense do you think is going to surprise us?
You know what? Here's the thing with defense, especially from a fantasy perspective. I really don't focus too much on defense. I literally wait till the end, or I draft somebody that I stream that matchup. So when you are looking at defenses, sometimes a matchup will make or break it. Last year, the Patriots surprised us, 224 fantasy points. That was pretty phenomenal. They were an ultimate defense. They had 47 sacks. They were crazy. So when you're looking at sacks, the Steelers surprised us last year, 54 sacks. It's tough to gauge, and especially because of the NFL draft and all the acquisitions, all these linebackers coming in and being filed in. Very, very tough to gauge. But in regards to a surprise defense, probably the Cowboys. I think the Cowboys have something to prove. They're America's team. I think they've made some nice improvements. So maybe the Cowboys from a fantasy perspective, but don't put too much weight on a defense. I even know that a lot of leagues are going without defenses. Try to get a defense. Try to get a top 10 defense based on last year. As soon as you see them come off the board, that's kind of my strategy in your draft. Is try to nail a top defense. But typically, sometimes I play matchups for defenses. Okay, so don't weigh too much on that. Just make sure you're covered at your skill positions.
All right, good advice. I got another question here from Zachary Layton. He wants to know, when would you pick a wide receiver?
Good question. So my 16 rounds, I really emphasize, this is a very good question. I really emphasize the robust RB. So I'm literally looking at wide receivers after round 4. And here's the good news for you for 2020 fantasy football. There's a lot of great news. There's a ton of wide receiver ones you can get after the 4th round. So you don't necessarily have to invest a first-round pick in a wide receiver. We saw last year Devonta Adams bust because he was hurt. We saw people, the mainstream, constantly tell you, hey, go Odell Beckham round 1. And I told you 3 years in a row, avoid Odell Beckham. So you can get Landry later. You can get Terry McLaurin later. You can get Marquise Brown later. You can get T.Y. Hilton later, like round 4 or 5. You can get Metcalf. You can get Ridley. You can get Cooks. I mean, there's 150 free targets now available in Houston, and Brandon Cooks is there, right? Not the most reliable receivers, but if you stack these guys, you're going to be solid because you're going to get a lot of depth at wide receiver. You're going to get wide receiver ones after the 4th, 5th round, and you don't have to invest the first-round pick. There's a ton of depth at wide receiver. Not to mention, Norb, listen, there's a ton of rookie guys coming in that are in a slot and a position to succeed. Denzel Mims, don't trust the Jets. Good opportunity there, right? Justin Jefferson, another good opportunity where he could be immediate fantasy football impact. And there's a couple other wide receivers. I talk all about this in the 16th round. Wait on wide receiver a little bit later, but start looking at one at rounds 4, 5, and 6. Start loading up.
Again, if you want to check out Joseph's program, 16 Rounds, it's a revolutionary video program to get everything about fantasy football, which I'm excited to learn about since I'm just as new gets. Check out the link in the description. Keep your questions coming. These are great. I got another one here. Question from Blaze Films wants to know, which kicker is the best to get and when should we draft them?
Norb, if you know fantasy terms, they're just joking. Nobody cares about it's a stupid question. This is a redundant question.
Okay, well, I say I don't know. So you're like, you pull me onto it.
You've got some smart asses in the group. When it comes to kicker, I'm going to answer it. It's a stupid question. It's kind of funny. It's just kind of like a fantasy kind of inside joke thing where they say, "Oh, I'm going to draft a kicker round 1," because nobody cares about kickers. Like they're just like you could literally stream kickers all season. But I mean, based on points last year, because I'm going to be really critical about this, I'm going to go Harrison Butker, KC. I mean, they get down, they score touchdowns, so he's always going to get the point after, continue to get points. 153 fantasy points last year, followed by Will Lutz from the Saints, who had 153 points, and Justin Tucker. Those are your top 3 kickers based on last year. Other guys that could, emerge this year, Zane Gonzalez from Arizona. I think he's still there. But, kickers, I don't care. I like Greg Zuerlein as well. I call him down the line Zuerlein. So that's kind of my joke. But kickers, I mean, they're just joking around.
Luckily, down the line, Zuerlein was offline when we played him in prime time, and he missed the kick that would have won them the game when they played us here in Seattle. So a rare miss by Greg the Leg, or what's his other nickname? What's his other name they got for him?
Don't ask me about kickers, but listen, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. You're going to get hustled by your followers. I'm telling you right now, there's people already saying, if Norb is playing fantasy, I want to be in his league. So they're going to try to hustle you. I encourage you, Norb, to save you some time and money. Do not get into fantasy football with these guys unless you have my 16 rounds. In that case, you've got a challenge. You're going to give them a challenge, but they're trying to hustle you here. I can tell.
Well, I'm certainly not going to go into a battle unprepared. So, because separation is in the preparation. So I'm not going to jump into this thing head first and put my money where my mouth is when I don't even know what I'm talking about. So for sure, I definitely, if I'm going to do it, if I'm going to pull the trigger, I'm going to have to make sure I get the best training for it. And I think I know where to go, 16 rounds. Yeah. Let's see. Somebody asked, Kegels Bagels says, what do you see for Juju Smith-Schuster this year? Seems like a legit question.
Good question. Really good question. So he kind of went down last year, obviously, because of Big Ben's injury. But if you look at his targets, 166 targets back in 2018, he was a top 10 receiver, him and Antonio Brown. And Norb, there's this big debate going on is whether he was really a good receiver or was it Antonio Brown drawing the double coverage. And I'm leaning a little bit more towards Antonio Brown drawing that double coverage. I think Juju's good, but I don't think I'm going to invest a second or third round pick on him. Here's a secret when you're looking at Juju. Get Deontay Johnson and get Chase Claypool. Combo and stack those guys. You could probably get yourself Deontay probably in and around, and again, I'm going to memory because I do a ton of mock drafts, in and around 7 and round 8. You can get yourself Deontay Johnson, and then go ahead and you can get this guy for free. Chase Claypool, and now you've got a ton of volume because you want a quarterback that throws a lot, and Big Ben throws a lot, and he can make players great. But I think if they do double cover Juju, it's going to open up for either Deontay or Claypool. I don't know. One of those guys is going to really break out. If you get both, you cover yourself, okay? And Juju's a guy that may line up in the slot this year. So, I just don't want to invest in him. The ceiling is there, but I'm having a weird feeling about him. I don't really trust him.
All right, Joz Whedon says Legatron. That was the name I was trying to remember. Legatron. That was a nickname for him. But we're not going to talk about kickers because you don't care about them. So we won't continue wasting more breath on that. Let's see. Another question here. Drew Alba says, should I worry about drafting a QB early or risk getting stuck with a below average QB? I have a big league.
I wonder how many QBs you have in that league. If it's a one quarterback league, you can wait. So I've been doing a ton of mock drafts. Literally, you can wait. Check this out. You can get Matt Ryan or Russell Wilson or Josh Allen. Who else is in that category there? You get all those guys in and around round 7. If you want to get a round 5, a one quarterback league, again, 12 person, Kyler Murray, Dak are coming out 5th round. I think that's still early. Guys, there's a ton of value at quarterback. Literally, you can wait to the end and get yourself Drew Lock and Phillip Rivers. And I always get a backup for a QB. Always get backups, okay? So if you're in a one quarterback league, get 2 quarterbacks. If you're in a 2 quarterback league, get 3 quarterbacks, okay? There's a ton of reasons why I implore you to do this. One of them being, Norb, it's a long story, but I'll try to shorten it. I was in a 2 quarterback league once, literally true story. And my quarterback was on bye week. One of my quarterbacks was on bye week. So I went into the free agency to pick up a quarterback for that week. And literally one jerk in my league literally had 4 quarterbacks on it. He had like everybody. He basically stole them and was storing and hoarding all of these quarterbacks. So I had no quarterback. My second quarterback was gone for that week. So always get a backup. And literally, there's a ton of depth at quarterback. You can get yourself. Nobody's even looking at Big Ben later. He could be value late. Phillip Rivers later. Daniel Jones, Drew Lock. Tons of value. You can wait. Now, if it's a 2-quarterback league, you may want to look at a quarterback early on. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. Hopefully it does. We got more questions coming in, and you are watching live. I've got my special guest, Joseph, the Fantasy Football Counselor. His Instagram is there at Fantasy Football Counselor. His Twitter handle is at FFCounselor1, and his YouTube channel is also in the description, as well as the link to his 16 rounds program. We got a few more minutes to go to take more questions, right? I know I want to be respectful of your time, but maybe 5-10 minutes left here, Joseph?
That's fine. Yeah. I just did a post right now on the Rams going by running back by committee. So just that news kind of broke recently. So my Instagram is blowing up. People pissed off because we all thought everybody was excited about Cam Akers. Now, Steve, whatever his name is, Sean McVay is talking crap now. So we're all angry right now. Norb, fantasy world's angry right now.
Well, I'm not angry. Maybe someday I will be. All right, another question. When is it good to draft a flex player, and who would it be? This is from Blaze Films.
I don't even look at it as a flex player. I just try to grab the best players available and just flex the best player available. So you're literally I've never really been asked that question. Just basically go ahead and draft the best possible players, which I recommend in 60 rounds. Guys that for a running back are in a minimum committee. Guys that are wide receivers that are slated wide receiver 1 on their team that are going to get a ton of targets. And you basically put in the best flex player possible. Hopefully that makes sense.
All right, I got another question from Drew Alba. He says, the hardest thing for me to do every year is to find good tight ends. I then get stuck picking up below average tight ends all year. You got any advice regarding tight ends?
Yeah, good question. So I never, ever invested a tight end early. And I remember a couple of years back, everybody was drafting Gronkowski first round. I said, don't do that. Don't draft Gronkowski first round. Ended up getting George Kittle. Okay, George Kittle, I got him in like the 10th round. He ended up having a better year than Gronk. I think this was 2018. So here's kind of the secret with tight end. This is where I roll my dice. So I always get the most secure running backs. I try to get the best possible wide receivers. I always anchor my team with an ace quarterback. When it comes to tight end, this is where I literally roll the dice. I wait in and around rounds, 9, 10, and I get myself, for this particular year, you could probably get yourself maybe a TJ Hawkinson. I know he had a bad year last year, but I think that was because of Stafford being injured. So you get yourself 2 tight ends with a high ceiling later on. And that's pretty much a secret tight end. Secret tight end is just as long as you get yourself 10 points out of your tight end weekly, you're good. I don't put a lot of weight on that tight end position. I genuinely don't. I'm very, very running back heavy and upside wide receivers and ace quarterback with a solid that's proven in production. And you can see those trends. With quarterbacks, you see trends of consistent production. With running backs, you can kind of see that even though they get hurt and stuff like that. But with tight ends, it's kind of volatile aside from the 2 top tight ends that finish every year, like your Kelce's and Kittles and stuff like that. So yeah, stack them. Get 2 tight ends later. Higbee's kind of a safe option as well. Who else? Hurst could be a good option as well with the Falcons, who's coming in to replace Hayden Hurst, who's coming in to replace Hooper, who's now in Cleveland, which I don't like as much, but he has a ceiling there as well. But anyway, that's my advice. Stack them and get them late.
Hey, Joseph, on the subject of tight ends, the Seahawks picked up Greg Olson, kind of out of retirement in the offseason here. What can we expect from Greg Olson? Do you think he's got anything left in the tank? Do you think he's going to do anything? I know he's probably not going to be on anyone's fantasy list, but just from a football standpoint, do you think he's going to contribute? Do you think he has anything to give to the Seahawks this year?
I got to have a term for this. Typically with not retired players, people that are close to retirement, I should say, players that have, years to wow us, they haven't wowed us as of late. Now, this guy, I want to give him a lot of credit. I think he went, I don't know how many years he's been playing in the league, like 50. Anyway, long story short, for like 10 years, this guy was Iron Man. Like when I say Iron Man, like this guy never got hurt. As of late, he's been declining. Now he's on a totally different offense. He's going to probably have a couple good games where he's going to boost. He might have a touchdown or 2 touchdown game, and you may not hear from him for 3 games. And I don't trust him. That's just the bottom line, because we've been sensing a decline over the past couple of years. And, I just don't trust him. That's just the bottom line. And again, he's going to give you guys some value from a reality point of view, a few games, but week in, week out, not a guy I can trust from a fantasy perspective. And I could be wrong, but this is my feeling on this.
Robin Rosiers asks, what if all the workhorses are off the board? Do you change the strategy or keep loading up on running backs?
You should be the one taking the workhorse running backs off the board. So the way that my 60 round is laid out, you should have workhorses. Like if you were going late first round, Josh Jacobs would be there. If you're going early second, Fournette and Gurley should be there. Coming back around, you could roll the dice. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he could be a workhorse. He's coming off in the second round. So let's just say you combo Saquon, Helaire, Fournette if he falls to the third, and let's say David Johnson. You're set. You don't even got to worry about running backs later. You've got 4 workhorse running backs early on, and then maybe you can get some sleepers later on. I talk about who those guys are in 16 rounds, So you shouldn't be worried about running backs if you get them early. There's a ton of running backs that you can load up on in the first 4 rounds that you're absolutely covered. And I encourage you guys, I implore you to go running back robust RB, because if you don't, 5th round, you're going to be looking at the Phillip Lindsays of the world and the Jordan Howards of the world, and nobody wants those guys.
Chayton Hyde asks, do you think Lamar Jackson will be good this year, or was he a one-year wonder?
Good question. I think he's going to still be good. The only thing that's ever going to hinder Lamar is injury. Now, 176 rushing attempts last year. That's a lot. He ran it 176 times. That is insane. Now, I don't have the stats in front of me. I'm going to pull them up real quick. I think he rushed more. He has more rushing yards than like every running back except for like 5. It's like this crazy statistic. I'm pulling it up here right now because I got everything in front of me all the time usually. Or if not, I've memorized it. So I think it was like, I don't have it exactly, but his rushing yards were like 1,200 plus. He was like the 7th biggest rusher last year. That's insane. And when you do that, the point I'm trying to make is it doesn't matter what he rushed. The point is that if you do that, you're putting yourself at risk. And, I'm afraid. I'm afraid for him. I fear for him. And I'm afraid for my fantasy team. If I invest a 2nd round pick for a guy that runs the ball that much, and I think that this year by acquiring Dobbins, their goal is to have them run the ball instead of him, and that would be a smart move if I'm the Ravens.
In general, do running quarterbacks work better in fantasy or more of the pocket throwers?
It's a good question. It's kind of a mix, right? I mean, you got a bunch of players that throw the ball and do really well, and then you got a bunch of runners that do well. I mean, it is actually a big perk, obviously, if they run the ball, because you're getting on average, 10 yards rushing gets you an extra point, especially when they feel, incentivized to want to run it in for a touchdown, which is great. Ideally, you definitely do want that running versatile quarterback. I think Russell Wilson's a good mix of that. He's not overly crazy like Lamar Jackson around the ball, but he can also throw the ball if he needs to. I like that. But you could also get really good value out of Matt Ryan, who's had some really pinnacle fantasy years, and he doesn't run the ball as much. So, it's fair to say both of them produce. Depends on who it is.
All right, I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I want to get a couple more questions from the chat, and then I've got just a couple of my own here. But I think there's a couple of Seahawks receiver questions. Do you think Phillip Dorsett could be good or bad for the Seahawks offense? This is from Chris Cantillis. And then Shervin's FO says, what are your thoughts on Josh Gordon's potential impact? So maybe talk about both those guys in one answer. Phillip Dorsett, Josh Gordon. Josh Gordon, we don't even know if he's going to be playing, but Phillip Dorsett definitely coming from the Patriots to Seattle. Well, what do you think about those guys? There's been a lot of talk about them being picked up in the offseason.
Okay, so one phrase, 7 syllables, okay? I think it's 7. Years to wow me, and I'm not wowed. That's it. I mean, that's all I got to tell you. I'm not going to expect anything big out of them. Again, similar. They may, run a route, catch a touchdown, have some boom games. What has Dorsett done? I think he was on the Colts, and then he went to I think it was the Patriots. And now, years to wow me, and guess what, Norb? Guess what? I'm not wowed. Same type of thing. Gordon, I mean, he's showing flashes. I'm sick of the Gordon talk. I think that's total BS. Enough. Yes, he's great, but he's done nothing lately. Nothing. I don't want to hear any more about this Gordon guy. Like Arnold said, put the cookie down. I had enough of this Gordon. It's like I'm a terrible voice there, but
that was pretty good.
Enough.
All right, so Robin Rosiers asks, could Kyler Murray become the next Lamar Jackson fantasy-wise?
Okay, yeah. So this is a big thing in the fantasy world where everyone's, expecting Kyler to take this like big leap going into 2020. I think he could, but I'm just not going to bank on it. Everyone's expecting, he's going to be the next Mahomes. He's going to be the next Lamar. Because again, they have these like sophomore years that are good, and then they just blow up and have this pinnacle year. And it's a good question. I think he's set up from a strategical standpoint, from a weapon standpoint, the acquisition of obviously Hopkins, Drake catching the ball in the backfield. They've acquired Benjamin at running back. I think he's like a 7th round guy, but he's a guy from Arizona State, which I think the Cardinals could love. Bottom line is I think he's got the tools. He's got the upside to do that. Am I going to invest a 5th round pick to find out? Probably not. I'm not going to do that. But again, the ceiling is there. I don't know. I couldn't even. I'm going to say the ceiling's there. It's possible, but I'm not going to risk it from a fantasy point of view.
All right, I want to ask you a question. Obviously, big news during the offseason was Brady and Gronk going to the Buccaneers. Leaving fantasy for. Well, actually, no. You can make this a fantasy question as well. But how will Tom Brady and Gronkowski on the Bucs? How will they fare fantasy-wise? And how do you think the team will finish, especially as compared to the Patriots this year? That's a 2-part question.
Okay, call me a bit of a conspiracy theorist, but I remember going back to Cam Newton when he had a superpowered team, and the Denver Broncos offense looked terrible. It looked like Manning was throwing beach balls in that Super Bowl. It was terrible. It was just terrible. And I don't know, maybe I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist, but I think the stars are aligning to the Buccaneers winning the Super Bowl this year. I mean, they've got amazing tools at wide receiver. I think Rojo and Keyshawn Vaughn, the rookie Keyshawn Vaughn, going to get some work done in the backfield, and they can both catch the ball in the backfield pretty well. I think they are primed to win. From a fantasy perspective, Gronkowski, as long as O.J. Howard is there, is going to have some competition, but Brady could just gravitate to Gronk. Gronk, obviously, for fantasy, hard to trust because he hasn't been able to stay on the field coming off that time off, could be a little bit rusty. I just think they're primed to succeed from a realistic point of view. And from a fantasy point of view, Tom Brady, another guy you can get in and around round 6, 7, 8, depending on where he falls and if people really want him. Great value. He's going to have a big year. Love him.
So obviously you're talking Super Bowl, so that pretty much answers that question about how the Patriots or the Buccaneers will fare better. It sounds like you've already answered that question. So tell me, as we're wrapping this up here, who do you see being in the Super Bowl this year? What are the two teams?
Man. I haven't even thought that far. Man, my head is spinning with fantasy. Man, that's a tough one. I don't see the 49ers making it that far this year again. I think they're just one of those teams, kind of like the Eagles, where they kind of made the Super Bowl and then they kind of going to fall off this year. So maybe that's good news for you Seahawks guys.
Great news.
So it's tough to gauge. I'd have to look at it. Super Bowl favorites just in general. Obviously, the Chiefs always are going to make a run for it. I think the Ravens could make a run for it. I think the Buccaneers could make a run for it. Oh, man, it's tough to gauge right now. I'd have to take a look at it. But, yeah, those are the 3 teams that I think could really, really make a good run for it this year.
I noticed you forgot to mention a certain team out of the Pacific Northwest. You forgot to list them.
Well, that goes without saying. The Seahawks are obviously...
No, it goes with saying. You've got to say it. I got to hear it coming out of your mouth, friend.
I have a board here. I can't show you on the side of the board. Russell Wilson sticker on the side of the board. I should have had him displayed here.
Yeah, you should have. Yeah. Come on now.
Yeah,
you're on my show. That Seahawks fans here.
I'm not prepared.
All right. Well, I think this has been great. Well, obviously, this isn't the last time this is the start of many conversations, I'm sure, especially as we get closer to the football season. And again, clearly, when it comes to fantasy football, Joseph, you're the man, and you've answered a lot of people's questions here, and certainly mine. And I look forward to talking more about this as the season crawls and creeps along, however that season's going to look this year. I think we'll have one. It's a question of who's going to be watching in the stands and how's the game going to be changed. It's all a big crapshoot. But I guess one quick thought: what do you think? Just in all this fantasy planning and all this stuff, what's your thoughts on what the 2020 season is going to look like? I mean, if fans of stands, how will the game look this year in your perspective, months ahead of when the season's supposed to start?
Well, I definitely see it happening. What I'm thinking is probably no fans in the stands, and I'm assuming that if there is going to be fans, it's going to be spread out really well. So maybe half the tickets are going to be sold. But I really feel it's going to be more digital this year, not only from the fact that, let's just say everything does open up. I think people are going to have some post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is a serious thing where people are just going to be afraid to go out. Even me, man, I don't feel warm and fuzzy getting into crowds right now with what has happened. I'm not a fearful person, but from a precautionary standpoint, because I have a family and kids, I'm going to be a little bit cautious in regards to approaching masses. So yeah, I think it's going to be more streaming this year, that type of thing. So
do you think, we've talked a little bit about what games how that'll affect games, no crowds. Obviously, Seattle, CenturyLink Field, crowd noise is a big factor, and possibly taking that out of the equation or reducing it. Do you think that'll have a significant effect on the games and in fantasy if it does turn out to be more of that type of game?
Yeah, I think it will. It depends, because a lot of people are, especially home teams, they're really fired up by the crowds, and the crowds make a huge impact. It's definitely going to take away, but we've been watching a lot of UFC lately. Well, I have been anyway. It hasn't seemed to affect the fighters that much, which is good. And me being a fighter before, I did some MMA in the past. When you're in the zone, you're in the zone. You know what I'm saying? It's like you're focused on the game. Rarely do you hear the background noise. You may hear your coach yelling at you in the back, but once you're kind of honed in and focused, you're kind of in the zone. I think it'll play some factors. I think play calling's got to be a little more secretive, that type of thing. I think you're going to be heard on certain things. So yeah, things are going to change, and it may affect certain players who need that fan fuel, I should say. So yeah, I think it's going to play a factor. I just don't know how greatly.
All right, I got to ask one last question before we wrap this up. Jadeveon Clowney, obviously the Seahawks fans here are on a major watch, trying to find out where he's going to go, what's he going to do. What do you think is going to happen with Clowney in 2020?
You know what? I don't really talk defensive players at all, to be honest with you. I just hope he finds a good home and the talent is there. I mean, from a defensive point of view, I don't like to weigh in too much.
All right. Well, I'll take that as a definite maybe that he'll be back in Seattle. Which is everybody's best guess is a definite maybe.
Let's put it this way. He's a huge impact player. And it would be ideal if he comes back. But are you willing to pay the price?
Yeah. All right. My special guest, Joseph, the fantasy football counselor. You can find him on Instagram at fantasy football counselor, or on Twitter at ffcounselor1. Also check out his YouTube channel. The link is in the description. And if you really want to get into fantasy football, check out his 16 rounds program, a revolutionary video program. It's in the description. Check it out. That's it. I just wanted to thank you, man, for being on the show. Your insight is tremendous, and again, just from the people who've talked about you, obviously you have a good reputation for the folks you have helped out in fantasy. So perhaps I might be one of the new disciples of your program once I take that leap. But I'm definitely now got a path of where at least I can feel like I got a place to go. So appreciate you being on the show, man. And to everybody else out there watching, those of you who have commented in the chat and the super chat, thank you so much. And make sure you subscribe. Check out both our channels. And if you haven't subscribed here, please do so. Hit that notification bell, and we'll continue to talk during the off season. But Joseph, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate you for having me on, and thank you for everybody in the comments. Great questions, minus the kicker question. That guy's a jerk. Everybody else, you guys are awesome. I appreciate you.
All right, Joseph, be well, and we will talk again soon. Thanks for being on.
Talk soon, guys. We're out.
All right, later. Go Hawks.
Bye-bye.